let's talk about something equally exciting, which is called keyed properties. Oh my, that was just so beautiful when I found out what that was all about. I think I've shared my findings on Discord. Let me just go and briefly bring that up because it's just such a nice thing to see. So key properties, I was exploring controllers in DAZ Studio, and I'll explain more about controllers in my animated crab video. Controllers are magical properties as well. They essentially allow you to use a single slider and make that one slider do multiple things at once in your project. There we go. So this is how this works. So I've been playing around with controllers and this is what came out. So this is a single slider that can make multiple expressions. As I move the slider, and I've made this myself, so I'll show you in a minute how to do that as well. As I move the slider, it goes through various properties on the figure. So these are all expressions, I believe, from the Fred Rise to Fame bundle. They come with that. And I've added them to a single slider. So it's almost like I had a mini timeline in my slider there. And it doesn't just work with expressions, it also works with full body poses. And when I discovered that, I thought, my goodness, this just reminds me of what the Pose Architect products and the Zevo growing up morphs, what they look like. Because they make that happen. They essentially have one slider and you morph the Genesis figure from a little boy or little girl to an elderly lady and a grown-up in between. So this is what 3D Universe does with the Toon Generation figure as well. You have one slider that turns the whole Genesis figure from a toddler into an adult and into an old man, and it just goes through these stages. And I was always wondering, how do these people do it? And I believe keyed properties is how this works, and it is fairly simple once you know what to click and where to go. And let me show you how it works. Yes, keyed properties, my goodness. And it's just so refreshing when you find something that that you've not known before. You think, oh my god, it's like magic. I believe Brian said, you said it was wizardry. So let's go and let's do this with expressions. Let me show you this with expressions. So I'll go and grab myself a Genesis, just a gray Genesis figure for now. So I can recreate exactly what I've done there. I'll use the Genesis 8 male. I wish I've used the 8.1 male. I'm sure we'll find expressions for him. So here he is. Let's go and zoom into his face so we can see what his expressions are going to look like. And I don't know if I have expressions. I'll just dial some in. I think I'll just dial some in. So in the head we have expressions, and I'll just go and pick a few, like maybe afraid and angry. I mean, they're not fantastic, but you get the point. In order to mix and match between them, I can either dial these sliders up for any given situation, but sometimes I like a combination of two things. So maybe afraid and angry together makes me the better morph combination rather than just using one of them. And if you're making a lot of renders in the same scene, like for a comic or for a visual novel, you need to have quick access to a multitude of expressions quickly. And I've showed you recently how to do this with Puppeteer. So that's another very, very cool way of doing it. You just go and add these little dots around it. I'll just show you again. If you go and add an empty dot here, and you go and crank up this expression, put another dot here, and then zero this one out, and then add the angry expression, put that dot here. And then the moment you switch this over to preview, you can go and interpolate between these expressions. And you can do that with as many expressions as you like. I always recommend you have one neutral dot in your Puppeteer preset. So essentially what it's doing is, as I move my little crosshair, it'll interpolate between these values. And that's kind of cool. But that's one way to do it, and it takes some time to set up. Let me go and delete all these pose presets here. Just right click and hit delete. Set these guys back to 0, and we're not using Puppeteer for that. Instead, we're using these key properties now. So if you go and open your regular timeline at the bottom, what I've just shown you with the puppeteer is very similar to what the timeline does with interpolated values. So if I have one keyframe, I have 30 frames on my timeline as it is. I'll set one keyframe with a 0 expression here, and maybe I have another one, say on frame 5, I'll crank this up to afraid. So now I go and interpolate between these. This is essentially what the puppeteer tool did as well. And just in case you're not familiar with the timeline, what it does is it'll interpolate values over time. And so at this frame, it'll have whatever's dialed in now. At this frame, it'll have whatever's dialed in now. If I go to frame 10, I can go and set this back to 0 and maybe add angry to my expression timeline here. And then it'll interpolate from here and then over to here. That's how I'll do it. I'm gonna go and add a few more expressions here. So angry, I'll set that to 0 on frame 15 and maybe say, I don't know, confident, is that good? Yeah, that's subtle. Contempt maybe. Yeah, it's okay. It's good. Contempt and disgust at the same time. That's a good expression. Goodie. And then on frame 20, I'll just use a couple more. I'll set this to 0. I'll set this to 0. And maybe on frame 20 we'll go with excitement. By the way, if you're interested in, no, this is a bit strong here, isn't it? I gotta make sure that this here is also set to 0 because otherwise those expressions are a little bit overkill. Yeah, sometimes it's a bit of an issue when expression values go a little overboard. We want to be on 0 here, and maybe 25 is probably enough for this demo. So my timeline does this, and it's almost like what I want my slider to do. So that's, you know, that's number one. That's kind of number one part of the puzzle. So number two is, how do we turn my timeline into a slider like that, like what I've shown you. So, you know, looks like he's going to swear. Absolutely. Pugwash, welcome. Good to see you. That is exactly what he looks like. So I'll go, and you can put this anywhere you like. You can put it under pose controls. I might just go and put it in the top, somewhere in the top. Maybe pose controls, is that a good idea? There's so much in here already. I might just go put it in my pose controls at the very bottom here. So just that it's inside pose controls. So first thing I need to do is put the whole parameters tab into edit mode. I think that's how it works. Somehow. Edit mode. There we go. So right click anywhere here and turn this whole thing into edit mode. Once it's in edit mode, right click on here and select create a new property, and that'll create ourselves that new slider that we want to make. So let's go and make that happen. Create a new property. It'll come up with another dialog that'll first of all ask us what property type is it. Float's good. What name would you like to use? There's name and label. So there, if you ever distribute these things, there's fairly strict ways of you should. So the label is whatever is displayed here, like angry HD or whatever, and I'll just call that magic slider for now. If you type that into name and then hit tab, it'll populate both the name and the label. So the name is what DAZ Studio is using underneath under the hood, so that should be something very unique. I'm not sure how we deal with this in key properties, but in joint corrective morphs and morph controlled morphs, you usually preface this with MCM and then the vendor and then the product and then the actual name. So you make that very unique. So in our case, I don't really know what to call it. Maybe I'll call it KC for keyed, or KP for key properties, and then maybe I'll call it J, and then I'll say magic slider, and I'll avoid spaces here, just so that you know what that is. If you're testing around, it's not a problem, but if you ever were to release this, make sure the name is something very unique so that it can't conflict with something that another vendor might have released. So we have the same thing with WordPress plugins. If you have a function that's called the same as something that another person may have created, then two functions that are called something that are the same might just confuse the program underneath it. So make sure it's kind of unique if you distribute it. If you're playing around, no problem. Everything else we can just go leave as it is. There's one property at the bottom here that says the minimum value is set to -1. I'll set that to 0 because that's, you know, I don't want this to go into the negative area. There's also the path here. That is also important. This is where this thing is actually going to show up. So I want to put this under my pose controls, but in the very top directory. So on the top pose controls. If I wanted to, and I'd like for this to be in my own folder, I can just go and put a / in here, say pose controls /J. That might do that. Let's go and create a new folder here into which the slider then goes. That's really that. So I'm going to go and also tick this box at the bottom here that's called create as empty morph, and then I'll go and create it. It looks like everything is gone, but of course it isn't really. It's in pose controls under J. There's my magic slider. I have to, because I'm still in edit mode, I have to double click into it so that the slider does something. But currently it doesn't do anything, so I need to give it some functionality. So I think the way this works is if I, in edit mode, I crank this up to 100%. I think this is how it works. Do forgive me if it doesn't. It's just very, very new to me. Yes, it is such a handy tab, Biscuits, absolutely. And now comes kind of the crazy part. So with it in edit mode, with it dialed up to 100%, go and right click on that slider and find this magic property here, which is called Erc Freeze. I think Brian was saying earlier on my Patreon post where I made that, where I told you all about that discovery. He says it seems that whenever the cool stuff is happening, Erc Freeze is involved, and it does just so much good stuff. So Erc Freeze is a function, if I understand it correctly, that will, a bit like the timeline, magically calculate interpolations and interpolated values of things. So you use Erc Freeze if you have a custom character and the skeleton isn't quite in the same position as the custom character. That's when you'd use Erc Freeze with the skeleton in the correct place. So it will say something to DAZ Studio along the lines of, hey, when this slider is dialed up to 100%, then all these positions are correct. So if ever the slider gets dialed down to something else, please make sure that the values are interpolated correctly, all the values that are associated with this Erc Freeze that are kind of back calculated to whatever the slider position is. So if you have something that makes something big and small, it would have to calculate between the big and small according to that slider. But it also works with multiple other properties. So you had like 20 properties that have changed to make this one slider happen. Erc Freeze would tell DAZ Studio, hey, calculate all 20 as the user modifies the slider. So it's super, super powerful. So I'll go and I'll click it, and another scary window comes up that says, you know, my property. That's the crazy name that I've given it, and looks like I don't really see anything in here. It would show there would be multiple values here if you had other values controlling things. We don't have that, but what we have is this here, keyed extract from play range. And as soon as I click that, I get all these deltas that are being moved on the timeline. And keyed means that this Erc Freeze is now going to look at my timeline and say, hey, whatever happens in the play range, which is in my case 30 frames, it could be much longer than that, it could be much shorter than that. Just grab all these properties and populate them all along the space of the slider, so to say. That is all I need to do. If I hit accept, then my keyframes on the timeline have disappeared. My slider is still at 100%. That's cool. I can take this out of edit mode now with right click. And then I think as I move my slider, all these expressions are essentially locked in on the slider in each and every percentage. Is that cool or what? That is just absolutely magical. So if I had like my 20 favorite expressions, even something that I've made with Puppeteer, that I've cobbled together with Puppeteer, like my perfect 20 expressions that I like my characters to have at all times, rather than having to find those exact spots on Puppeteer, I can just go and create keyframes on the timeline from that, put them all on one slider and save this slider with the figure, because this is now just a regular morph. So once you've made all that hard work and you think, oh, this is actually super handy on every of my forthcoming characters of this generation, you can just go and save this out with file, save as. support asset, morph asset. So this is something, it's just like a regular morph that you save out now. So on this gives you another massive long list of things. So in it was in Genesis 8 pose controls. In my case it was under J, and in my case it was just the magic slider. So I just go and tick this and save that out and give it the correct library where I want to save this. Probably not your main library. You probably want to split this out into a separate library, especially if you want to distribute this. Fill out your vendor name and your product name. This denotes where in the data folder of this asset directory this is going to go. Very, very cool. Isn't that amazing? I find that absolutely amazing, because it's just another trick that if you use that, it just makes your life so much easier if you cranking out a lot of renders for comic book and visual novel production. Good stuff, isn't it, Chris? And of course it means you can morph your figure in any which way. Like if you had something, let me show you another variation of the same theme here. If I have an Annie block that is essentially an animation of the guy getting up or down or about to be sitting in a chair, it's kind of difficult to extract those from animations. So let me see if I can find something like that. Probably just in the regular Annie blocks. No, that's not it. Is it maybe in Animate? Is that where that is? No, that's also not where that is. Walk construction kit. Oh, there we go. Ups and downs. Is that something that'll work? Oh no, that's not for the right figure, is it? There we go. That's a good option here. Jump really for the Genesis 8 female. But that's okay. I mean, if you want to portray a figure in mid-jump, so you go and drag this Annie block onto the Annie timeline here, and it'll do its thing. What we need is to put this onto the regular timeline. So there's an option here under just right click and choose bake to studio keyframes. That'll turn all these, anything that's contained in any of your Annie blocks, that'll bake that onto the regular timeline. Just say yes. And then we have a ton of keyframes here. Now we have a play range of 65. And say you wanted to portray a figure in mid-jump over the course of 3 or 4 still images. It would be really handy to extract those poses from here. While you can do that, you can just use the Erc Freeze in the exact same way. So now that we have the keyframes, I'll put this whole area back into edit mode, and I'll go and right click and create myself a new property. And I'll just call that jump, baby. And I can make the name uniquer. I'm going to leave it as it is for now, just to show you the principle again. I'll go and put the minimum to 0, just so that the slider doesn't go into the negative, because that's just going to be screwy as hell. I'll go and create this as a new empty morph. Create my property. There we go. Double click, crank it up to 100%. And at that point, at 100%, I'd like for this to Erc Freeze. So not at 0%. Not at 50%, not at some other value. It has to be at 100%. Right click the slider and hit for Erc Freeze. And it has already done, it has a lot of values in here already. I'm going to click the keyed extract from play range, because that's what I want. Then the values will change. Hit accept. All the keyframes will disappear. And this will now make my guy, woohoo, jump. But now you can use the timeline for something else. So you can now position your guy at some point in the whole sequence, then go and use deforce, because that's not going to change this value, but it might play with the timeline. You can do something else with the timeline. So use it to rotate your camera around this guy in mid-jump, like they did in The Matrix. With how many cameras were that? Like 120 cameras or something around a center, and that's how they could literally, on 35mm film, mind you, freeze the guy in mid-jump and then move the camera around. It was literally doing that, rolling 120 cameras or however many cameras it was at the same time, playing one scene in real life footage in the middle, and then freezing it and just changing from one camera to another at the same frame. So you can do all that. And yes, that's the magic of keyed properties. When I discovered that, I was thinking, my goodness, the possibilities. And also, it doesn't seem to care how many frames were on your timeline. So the first one had 30, and that is still, whoops, I need to take this out of edit mode here so that they are functioning. That works perfectly fine with 30, but this slider has been interpolated over 65 and it also worked well. So very, very cool, isn't it? Joseph, absolutely. That is a very, very cool trick. I thought so too. I thought I'd share it with you because I was really excited when I found it.